Hi, thank you so much, Hannah, for doing this presentation. My name is Janae. My name is Janae Hubbard. I am the EDI, or Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Program Manager here at Fielding School of Public Health. And today I'll be talking about respecting context. And really what we're talking about here is how do we sort of bring together and create a space of cultural humility and implicit bias? Like, how do we really address our own implicit bias and create an environment where we understand our context vulnerability and why we're here to support them and help them. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The learning objectives for this session is really, we're gonna learn how to explain implicit bias and how it might impact a contact tracer or a case investigator interview, and define cultural humility and describe how it relates to contact tracing and case investigation. Next slide, please. So these are the folks in your queue. So before you start your shift, you'll receive a list of names and contacts and their contact information. And really each of these names has a story and and that's what we really want when we talk about building empathy, is how do we understand their story and what does that look like? So I'm gonna go through the queue and give you sort of examples of who you will be talking to when your shift begins. So the first thing that we're looking at is Jen. Jen is a healthcare provider and lives by herself. She's worried she might have been using the protective equipment improperly. She hasn't seen her children and her grandchildren in weeks. She feels stressed and embarrassed to become part of the problem. Then we have Susan. Susan is struggling to manage the learning of her kids at home and her job as a cashier at a grocery store. She's a single parent trying to make ends meet. Then we have Adam. Adam was a target of racial slurs toward Asians the last week in his neighborhood. He lives in a multi-generational household and works in the kitchen of a restaurant. Michael is struggling with depression and insomnia. He's been out of work for 2 months and he's unstable and unable to pay rent. He lives in an SRO, or single room occupancy, with his partner. And lastly, we have Lupe. Lupe doesn't speak English and hasn't been well since last Friday. She feels very fatigued and sleepy. She's had a dry cough for the past 3 days. She's worried about seeking medical attention because she thinks it could impact her ability to gain lawful residency in the future. So these are just a few of the calls that let you know, like, this, who you're going to be talking to. And a lot of the folks that when you're doing these calls, you're going to be the experts for them in terms of providing them with the resources and supports. They're going to be on the phone with just having this information around that they may be exposed, and that's going to make them vulnerable. So as a trace investigator, your goal is not to, our contact tracer is not to solve their problems, but really to provide them with the support. That when you say something, words like quarantine and isolation, that those can be trigger words for people in terms of how they're going to support their family, what are those stressors that are going to come up for them. And so that's why we really want to think about how do we respect the context in which we are calling these folks for. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So the words about that you see right here are all of the things that could be coming up for an individual when you give them a call. There's mistrust, potentially, who is this calling me? They have their own anxiety around COVID, around supporting their family. They may have housing instabilities. What does this look like for them? If they were to isolate, if they're in a multi-generational home, where's the space for them to isolate or to quarantine for 2 weeks? There could be socioeconomic issues in terms of they have to work. They may be the sole supporter of their household. What does this look like for them in terms of now having to isolate and potentially not working? They could have immigration status where they don't understand the nuances of being testing positive and isolating, if that impacts their immigration status, if it doesn't impact their immigration status, and who are they talking to around this? And then there's just stigma for some people to be able to say that they have COVID or that they may have been exposed. What is the stigma that comes with that? And lastly, it's really looking at the culture and sort of what is that their cultural understanding around COVID and this disease in relation to their identity. Next slide, please. So we're going to do a poll, and which of these contextual challenges would you have the most difficult responding to? So if we could just go ahead and start having people fill out the poll. So we see a lot with immigration status. We're seeing really a lot around immigration status. I think I understand that one a lot. That has a tendency to be the toughest because it is illegal, and trying to address that for people and provide them with that support around that makes a lot of sense. A lot with mistrust, there were folks potentially hanging up. So we can go ahead, we're almost done. People, hanging up and not really understanding or just questioning a lot, like who's calling, why are you calling? Those are all things that definitely could be challenging when you're doing this. And that's why we want to really sort of create the context of understanding and how we lead this discussion from a place of empathy and understanding that everyone comes in with a variety of characteristics that make them very vulnerable. So if we can go to the next slide, please. And what we're going to talk about here is what is culture, and why culture is important when we're doing this talk, and we're doing contact tracing our case investigation, is because it allows for us to sort of formulate how we navigate through the world. It's our pattern of beliefs, it's the values that we hold, it's the thoughts and norms that we create, and it goes from generation to generation. It's usually passed down from family to family of like how your culture, your family's identity sort of navigates through this world. And the thing that's really important is it really tells us how to adapt to our natural and social environment, and really helps us to understand continuity. How do we actually move through this world? Is it all gained through our cultural understanding? And so if we can move to the next slide. And really the reason why we're talking and emphasizing culture so much is because we really want folks to understand that everyone on this call has a different culture and a different experience. They have a different way of growing up, a way of life of people, their behaviors, their attitudes, and their patterns are all dictated by their culture. And this is something that is learned through their family behaviors. And it really defines and shares boundaries. So you as a contact tracer or a case investigator have your own culture, your own understanding when you're making these calls, and so do the other contacts on the other end. They also share their own shared values and cultures. And we talk about this from a place of empathy because that's where we need to be culturally aware and have cultural humility around the way we engage others. So next slide, please. And so here, as you see, this is all the ways that culture is developed. It's and how we sort of align ourselves around our culture. So we look at our health status, our age, sexual orientation, immigrant status, religion, or spirituality, social class. There's ethnicity, gender, geography, race, physical, mental ability. These are all different ways in which our culture is shaped, but also the cultural lines in which we identify. So it's really important to think of all the things. I know I read through who would potentially be on your contact list, and why that's important is to really truly understand is that one, you don't know all of these, the ways that their culture is shaped. And it's really important that you, when you're doing this work, that you sort of take a step back to really understand who you may be talking to. So if we can go to the next slide, please. I think this is a great sort of a diagram analogy to really think about culture and think about how we see culture. So there's a lot that we see on the surface in terms of our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we touch. But really what's important around that is what we don't see, what's underneath, what's internal, what are those thought patterns, those values, those myths, those beliefs that we hold and that other people may hold that they don't get to see of us and we don't get to see of them around our culture, around our identity. And a lot of this comes in from our unconscious, this is our unconscious, subconscious around how we've navigated the world, how we've handled difficult challenges has really shaped how we show up. And that's the same for our contacts, is that you may be giving them this information and letting them know, and they may have a way of that they've always dealt with difficult information that you aren't aware of. And so you need to just be aware of the way that they respond, the way that they may be abrupt, that all of these things could be defense mechanisms for getting this information that could really be vulnerable and challenging for them at this time. So let's go to the next slide, please. So I really want to open the chat and give people an opportunity about our perception. So you see this picture here. I think this is a great way to talk about perception, is if we could open the chat, is what do folks see in this picture here? Give people an opportunity to see in the chat what they're seeing in this picture. So we have two people kissing, we have two people kissing, a dancer, we have a lady, people kissing, an angel, a woman, intimacy. We have engagement, two people kissing. First, so people see multiple things in this. This is excellent. This is great. This is a bride, an angel. So this is important. And the reason we start with this is because we do see different things. What I see two people kissing. Someone else sees a woman within the two people kissing. So we do see a lot of we do perceive the world very differently, and the way I see things and the way you see things are also going to be very different than the way our contacts see things. So we can go ahead and close the chat, but this just gives us an opportunity, and why we do start with this is that everyone sees the world differently, and especially in this time of COVID, and really how people are observing it, how people are practicing safety. You as a contact tracer and you as a person who's in this world navigating it also understand that everyone sees this differently. And so our job is to provide them with the information, be sympathetic, empathetic to what they're going through, and try to support them the best way that we can in order to be able to isolate. So let's go to the